Hey everyone, welcome back. So far we've started building up our knowledge of the historical timeline of the Nazi regime, looking at those first few years when the party rose to power. This time we're delving into the heart of the regime itself and considering the nature of Nazi ideology. So when we talk about Nazi ideology, we're talking primarily about what the Nazi party believed and how they projected these beliefs onto the population. To make this lovely and well structured for us, we're going to divide it up into 4 key areas: political ideology, economic ideology, military ideology, and social ideology, which we might as well call racial ideology. Let's kick off with what the Nazis believed about politics, so their political ideology. The Nazi regime's political ideology was first and foremost a nationalist ideology. The Nazis believed in holding up the ideals of a great and powerful German nation. We'll get to their racial supremacy later, but it's important to remember that the Nazis also held up a national supremacy and believed Germany to be a superior country in many ways. Nazi political ideology is a biggie, so let's talk about its 3 key aspects: the rejection of internationalism, the Führerprinzip, and its aggressive foreign policy. So we know that the Nazis were hugely bitter about the crippling terms of the Treaty of Versailles and their effects on the German population. A primary political goal of theirs was actually to get rid of the Treaty of Versailles altogether, or abolish it, and therefore get rid of the terms and agreements that came with it, such as the League of Nations. The Nazis rejected the outward-looking international perspective of the League and by extension of the countries who led the League, mainly the UK and France. And historians call this political stance a rejection of internationalism. Basically, Nazi Germany was majorly bitter about the Treaty of Versailles and the internationalist ideology which accompanied it. Instead, they looked inward to their own national interests and rejected all efforts for peaceful diplomacy and cooperation. Secondly, because Nazi Germany totally rejected democracy, their political ideology became centered on Hitler as the single source of power. Historians call this ideology the Führerprinzip, which is like the Führer's principle. And this is the belief that, as Führer, Hitler was the supreme leader who encapsulated the spirit of the nation and controlled all areas of the regime. Basically, the strong leader, the Führer, was seen as the cornerstone of the Nazi political system, and Hitler's single-handed subordination of the population and government characterizes much of the Nazi political ideology. Lastly, let's chat about aggressive foreign policy as another important part of the Nazi political ideology. Even though they were inward-looking and rejected internationalism, as we said, the Nazi government still needed to deal with some foreign affairs. They were aggressively negative about the whole ordeal. They pulled out of as many international agreements and treaties as they could, and only signed treaties with those nations they needed to protect their national interests and strategically set themselves up to win the war that Hitler was cooking up. So this is mainly the Rome-Berlin Axis signed with Mussolini's Italy in 1936, and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or Soviet Nazi Non-Aggression Pact, signed with Stalin's USSR in 1939. Which Hitler subsequently broke 2 years later, proving just how focused his foreign policy was on his own interests. Okay, cool. So, political ideology is the biggest aspect of the Nazi ideology as a whole, and this basically involves the Nazi Party's beliefs about putting national interests over internationalism, replacing democracy with the figure of the Führer as the supreme authority, and carrying out an aggressive foreign policy. Next up, we have economic ideology. The economic ideology of the Nazi Party can be boiled down to one really key concept called autarky. Autarky is a German word which basically translates to national self-sufficiency. This was the belief that the Nazi nation should be entirely economically self-sufficient. So, remembering what a sucky economic position they were in after World War I, Nazi Germany dreamed of restoring their economy to the point where they could stop depending on other countries to support their economy. Remember all that stuff about focusing on national interests and rejecting internationalism? Autarky is really just the economic part of that same idea. So essentially, the Nazi economic ideology was focused on the concept of autarky, or economic self-sufficiency. And now for military ideology. If you know much about World War II, you'll know that the Nazis were pretty keen on snapping up European territory. This falls under yet another funky German word, Lebensraum. This translates to something like living space. Not to be confused with a living room, living space refers to the Nazi belief that the German nation, and indeed the Aryan race, needed to expand to exercise its superiority. So the Nazi military ideology was expansionist. They wanted to take over or annex other countries and incorporate that territory into their nation. To be able to carry this out, the military also needed to be significantly extended, highly trained, and equipped with weaponry, which Hitler prioritized. A clear example of Nazi military expansionism is an event called the Anschluss in 1938, which was when the Nazis annexed their neighbouring German-speaking country of Austria, incorporating all of Austrian territory into Nazi Germany. So to summarise, the Nazi military ideology was underpinned by the concept of Lebensraum, meaning living space, the belief that the German nation needed to expand to fulfill their national destiny, which required a strengthened and well-equipped military. And finally, last but not least, social ideology. The Nazi regime's social ideology was entirely based around their warped views on race, which is why we might as well call it a racial ideology. To help us out with this one, let's look at a really disturbing concept called social Darwinism, which the Nazis were fond of. Social Darwinism promoted an evolutionary view of race. So, based on Charles Darwin's theories of evolution, this concept sees the Aryan race as the most evolved and therefore the most superior of all the races. As I'm sure you can imagine, the Jewish race fell very low on this evolutionary scale. While of course now discredited by scientists as absolute nonsense, in the Nazi regime, this theory was used to justify and legitimate their state-enforced racist beliefs and actions. So the superiority of the Aryan race, which was made legitimate by this theory of social Darwinism, was also emphasized through Hitler's movement to unite all racially pure German people together as the People's Community of Germany. There were calls for these ancestral Germans to return home to their motherland, at the same time that policies of ghettoization, clearing, and eventually extermination were removing those minority groups deemed inferior from the population. These extensive efforts of ethnic cleansing were masked by propaganda campaigns, which totally enforced this view of the destined racially pure Germany. So, with all of that heaviness, that's a wrap. In this video, we saw how Nazi political beliefs centered around rejecting the international community, obsessing over the Central Führer, and being aggressive in foreign affairs. Economic beliefs were focused on the concept of autarky, or economic self-sufficiency. Military ideology was all about expanding the Nazi state out across Europe and building up a strong military force to be able to do so. And finally, social or racial ideology was underpinned by social Darwinism, which saw the Aryan race as the most evolved and therefore superior race, and this ideology called for the people's community of pure Germans to come back to the motherland and, modern parallels totally unintended, make Germany great again. Good luck getting some solid study notes together on all of that, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!